The second torpedo hit the royal deck, and Princess Sira Vale Kithra of the Delani sovereignty felt the floor buckle beneath her bare feet. She had been standing at the navigation console when the first impact punched through the starboard hull 3 decks below. That one she absorbed, knees bending, hand catching the edge of the console, training overriding the animal instinct to freeze. The second one was different. The second one cracked the blast shield across the bridge viewport, spiderwebbed the reinforced crystal into a lattice of white fracture lines, and threw her sideways into the command, railing hard enough to split the skin above her left eye. Blood pale violet, the color of the Lanny circulatory fluid, ran down her temple and into the corner of her vision. She wiped it with the back of her hand and looked at the tactical display. 3 Corvathi destroyers, closing from the port quarter. The royal vessel Ascending Light was alone in the Vale corridor, a transit passage between the outer holdings and the homeworld that should have been safe, should have been patrolled, should have been anything other than what it was right now, which was a killing field. Shields at 19%, the weapons officer called from across the bridge. Lieutenant Eshara, young, competent, trying very hard to keep her voice level. Forward batteries are offline. The starboard launcher is jammed. Sira pulled herself upright against the railing. The bridge was a ruin of sparking consoles and emergency lighting, amber strips along the floor casting everything in a low, wounded glow. Half the stations were dark. The navigation officer's chair was empty. He had been thrown clear of his seat by the first impact and lay unconscious against the far bulkhead, a medic crouching over him. "Where are the escort frigates?" Sira asked. The communications officer, a thin, precise woman named Kelly's, whose silver-blue skin looked gray in the emergency light, turned from her console with an expression that answered the question before her words did. The Bright Crest and the Sovereignty's Edge both received recall orders 20 minutes before the attack. They were pulled back to the inner patrol line. On whose authority? Kelly's hesitated. The orders carry Regent Dothran's seal. The name landed like a blade between Sira's ribs. Regent Dothran, her uncle, the man who had governed the Delani sovereignty during her father's illness, who had spent 8 years building a power base inside the military hierarchy, while Sira attended diplomatic academies and learned the arts of governance she would never be allowed to practice. The escorts had been pulled. The route had been chosen for her. The Corvathi destroyers had known exactly where to find the Ascending Light and exactly when it would be unprotected. This was not an ambush. This was an assassination. Sira's mind raced through the implications even as the ship shuddered beneath her. Dothran had chosen the Vale corridor specifically because it was a dead zone too far from the inner patrol line for a rapid response, too deep in sovereign space for anyone to expect hostiles. He had drawn the route himself, presenting it to Sira's chief of staff as the quietest path home after her 5-week diplomatic tour of the outer holdings. Quiet. The word tasted different now. "Can we make the Sethani relay station?" Sira asked, already knowing the answer. Eshara shook her head. 7 hours at best speed. "We won't last 7 minutes. Long-range communications." Kelly's was working her console, her slender fingers moving rapidly across haptic controls designed for the Lanny hands 4-fingered, with an extra joint that allowed for a typing speed no human could match. "Jammed. The Corvathi are broadcasting a wide-spectrum interference pattern. Our signal can't get past 60,000 kilometers." 60,000 kilometers. The nearest the Lanny patrol vessel was at least 400,000 out. Even if Kelly's found a gap in the jamming, by the time anyone responded, the Ascending Light would be debris. A third torpedo struck the ventral hull. The ship screamed, metal tearing, structural beams torquing beyond tolerance, and Eshara's console erupted in a shower of sparks that drove her back 2 steps, her hand pressed against a burn on her forearm. "Shields are gone," Eshara said. The composure was cracking now. "We have nothing." Your Highness. The voice came from behind her, low, steady, carrying the particular flatness of someone who was calm not because they were unafraid, but because they had made a decision and intended to keep it. We need to get you off the bridge. She turned. The man standing in the bridge doorway was human. Garrison Specialist Cole Vassar, assigned to the Ascending Light 18 months ago as part of a Terran-the-Lanny military exchange program that both governments had treated as a political courtesy, and neither had taken seriously. He was one of 4 humans aboard. The others were a medic, a communications technician, and an engineering apprentice, and in the rigid hierarchy of the Lanny royal vessel, he occupied approximately the same rank as the maintenance drones that cleaned the air ducts. He was not supposed to be on the bridge. Bridge access during combat was restricted to commissioned the Lanny officers, and a garrison specialist had no more business on the command deck than a cargo drone. But the blast doors on Deck 4 had buckled, and he had come up through the emergency shaft, a vertical tube intended for maintenance access that most of the crew had never used, and nobody had stopped him because nobody was stopping anything right now. The 2 bridge guards who might have challenged him were both unconscious or repositioned. The chain of command was fragmenting in real time, and into that gap walked a man who had no rank worth mentioning and no orders to follow except the ones he gave himself. Sierra looked at him. He was tall for a human, not as tall as a Delaney, but close, late 30s. Dark hair cut short, graying at the temples in that way humans did that always struck her as peculiar, as though their bodies were marking the passage of time on the outside where everyone could see it. He had a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and had healed slightly wrong, a pattern of old scars across his knuckles, and eyes the color of storm water gray-blue, direct, unwavering. He wore the standard-issue dark fatigues of a Terran garrison specialist, and somewhere in the chaos, he had acquired a Delaney sidearm that sat on his hip in a holster designed for a hand larger than his. He was not handsome. He was not impressive. He was, by every measure the Delaney court used to evaluate males of any species, unremarkable. But he was standing in the doorway when no one else was standing anywhere, and his eyes were on hers, and something in the way he held himself communicated a single, unambiguous thing. He was not leaving. The bridge is the safest position on the ship, Sierra said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The command center is reinforced. The command center took a direct hit. Deck 7 is venting. The bridge reinforcement is cracked. He nodded at the spider-webbed viewport. One more torpedo on this bearing and this deck opens to vacuum. She knew he was right. She had already calculated it. But the calculus of a princess was different from the calculus of a soldier. If she left the bridge, the crew would interpret it as abandonment. If the crew believed their princess had abandoned them, what little cohesion remained would dissolve. I cannot leave my people. Your people need you alive. The 4th torpedo hit. This one detonated against the dorsal armor above the bridge, and the ceiling panels came down. Cole moved before she registered the danger 3 strides across the bridge, his body between hers and the collapsing panels, his arms covering his head as shattered composite rained down around them both. A fragment caught his shoulder and tore the fabric of his fatigue jacket. He did not flinch. When the debris settled, he was standing over her, breathing hard, a trickle of blood running from a cut on his forearm that he did not appear to notice. Composite dust coated his dark hair and settled on the shoulders of his fatigue jacket like ash. We need to move, he said, now. Sierra registered, in the part of her mind that cataloged details even under fire, that he had put himself between her and the ceiling without hesitation. Not as an officer following protocol. No protocol in the Delaney military covered a garrison specialist shielding a princess with his body. He had done it the way a person does something that does not require a decision reflexively, because the alternative was unthinkable. She filed that observation alongside the grief and the fear and the fury. in the place where she kept things she would examine later, if there was a later. She looked past him at the bridge crew. Ashara was helping the medic drag the unconscious navigation officer toward the aft exit. Kelly's was transmitting something rapid on her console coordinates, distress frequencies, anything that might reach beyond the signal-jammed corridor. 2 damage control technicians were sealing a ruptured conduit that was spraying coolant across the deck in a pale blue mist. They were handling it. They were doing their jobs, and they were watching her quick glances between tasks, checking whether their princess was going to stand or fall. Sierra made the call. "All hands, this is Princess Sierra." She spoke directly into the bridge speakers, and her voice carried through every surviving system on the ship. "Abandoned ship protocols are now in effect. All personnel proceed to evacuation pods. Priority to wounded, priority to non-combat crew. Move." The bridge erupted into controlled motion. Ashara locked down her weapons console with swift, practiced keystrokes. Kelly's began transmitting the evacuation beacon on every open frequency. The medic and the damage control team hauled the navigation officer toward the corridor, the stretcher clanging against buckled deck plates. "Ashara," Sierra caught the weapons officer as she passed. "How many operational pods?" 14. 2 more on the starboard side are damaged but pressurized. Total capacity for the remaining crew. Get everyone in. Nobody stays behind." Ashara looked at her a long look, the kind that measured what a person was made of. Then she nodded once and ran. Sierra stood at the command railing and watched them go. She counted bodies moving through the aft corridor. She counted the alerts on the surviving tactical display evacuation pod launches, registering one by one, bright amber pulses on the schematic. She did not move toward the evacuation corridor. Cole Vassar noticed. Of course he noticed. He had been watching her since he entered the bridge, and he read the decision in her posture before she made it consciously, the way she gripped the railing, the way her weight settled into her heels, the way her chin lifted a degree. "Your Highness, the Corvathi will target the evacuation pods if the ship systems go dark. Someone needs to keep the auxiliary power running long enough for the pods to reach minimum safe distance. Someone needs to stay. That's a 2-person job, at minimum." "I know." He crossed the bridge. Not quickly, not the urgent stride of someone trying to pull a princess to safety, but with the measured pace of a man walking toward a decision he had already made. He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough to speak without shouting over the klaxons, far enough to maintain the professional distance that the Villani military code demanded between a garrison specialist and a member of the royal house. "The auxiliary power relay is on deck 5, he said. "I can keep it running manually if the automated systems fail. But I need someone at the helm to hold the ship's profile, toward the destroyers, present the smallest target, buy time for the pods." "You are describing a suicide maneuver." "I'm describing a delay, 15 minutes, maybe 20, enough for the pods to get clear." She looked at him. In the amber emergency light, his face was all planes and shadows, the broken jaw, the stormwater eyes, the expression that was not brave and not resigned, but something between the two, something that looked like a man who had weighed his life against the lives in those pods and found the arithmetic simple. "Why?" she asked. The question came out before she could stop it, and it carried more than she intended. Not just "why are you volunteering?" That part was explicable, even admirable. But why are you here? Why did you come to the bridge? Why are you looking at me like I am something worth staying for? He did not answer immediately. He glanced at the tactical display, 3 destroyers, closing, weapons hot, and then back at her. "Because I'm not leaving you alone on a dying ship, Your Highness." The simplicity of it struck her like a physical thing. No flowery declaration. No oath of loyalty in the formal Villani register. No appeal to duty or honor or the exchange program that had placed him aboard this vessel. Just a flat statement of fact, delivered in the same tone he might have used to report a maintenance schedule. "I'm not leaving you." 4 words. In the formal Delaney, the phrase would have required 12 syllables, a conditional clause, and a suffix indicating the speaker's social standing relative to the recipient. In Terran Standard, it was 4 words, and they carried more weight than any 12-syllable construction Sira had ever heard in a council chamber. In 8 years of her uncle's regency, no one had said anything like it. Not once. Not the advisors who bent to Dothran's will. Not the courtiers who averted their eyes when Sira spoke in council sessions. Not the military officers who took their orders from the regent and treated the princess as a ceremonial artifact, beautiful, symbolic, and profoundly irrelevant. "Then we should move," she said. The words came out before the diplomatic part of her mind could intervene with something more measured, more appropriate to the register of a princess addressing a foreign enlisted specialist. But the diplomatic part of her mind had stopped running the moment Dothran's name came out of Kelly's mouth, and what remained was something older and simpler, the part that recognized when someone was offering something real and accepted it without qualification. They moved. The corridors of the ascending light were a nightmare of buckled plating and emergency lighting. Power conduits sparked from ruptured junctions overhead. The air tasted of scorched metal and the faint chemical sweetness of fire suppression foam. They passed the body of a crew member who had not survived the 3rd torpedo, a young sensor technician named Verith who had once brought Sira tea during a late watch and apologized for oversteeping it. And she forced herself to keep walking, filing the grief away in the place she kept things she could not afford to feel yet. 2 decks down, they found the secondary corridor blocked by a pressure seal that had deployed automatically when the hull breach on Deck 9 vented atmosphere. The seal was doing its job, keeping breathable air on their side, but it also blocked the most direct route to the auxiliary relay. Cole studied the seal for 3 seconds, then turned left into a maintenance alcove that Sira had walked past 100 times without noticing. He pulled open a panel in the floor, revealing a crawlspace that ran beneath the corridor plating. "It'll be tight," he said, "but it connects to the tertiary junction on Deck 5. I've used it to access the ventilation manifolds." She looked at the crawlspace. It was narrow, dark, and smelled of hydraulic fluid and burned insulation. The pale silver silk of her ceremonial robes, designed for a reception hall, not a crawlspace, would not survive it. "After you," she said. He dropped into the crawlspace without ceremony. She followed, tearing the lower hem of her robes on a protruding bolt and not caring. The space was barely wide enough for Cole's shoulders, and she could hear his breathing ahead of her, steady, controlled, the breathing of a man who had spent time in confined spaces and had learned not to let them shrink around him. Somewhere above them, the ship groaned again. A vibration ran through the plating beneath her palms, deep, structural, the kind of sound that meant load-bearing members were approaching their failure threshold. The ascending light was dying by degrees, and each degree brought them closer to the moment when the structure could no longer hold itself together. Cole led. He moved through the damaged corridors with the competence of someone who had memorized the ship's layout during the 18 unremarkable months he had spent maintaining its tertiary systems. He knew where the emergency hatches were. He knew which structural members had buckled and which were holding. He knew, when they reached a junction that was blocked by collapsed ceiling plating, that there was a maintenance crawlspace 11 meters back that would bypass it. At one blocked section, a fire burned behind a sealed pressure door, the heat radiating through the metal in visible waves. Cole tested the adjacent corridor, found it compromised by coolant flooding, and backtracked to a utility shaft that Sira had not known existed despite living on this ship for the past 5 weeks of her diplomatic tour. "How do you know this ship better than I do?" she asked as she followed him into the shaft. The crawlspace walls pressed close, and she could feel the heat of the fire they had bypassed radiating through the deck above a low, persistent warmth that reminded her how thin the margin between safety and catastrophe had become. "You lived on decks 1 through 4, he said without turning, his voice slightly muffled by the confined space. "Diplomatic suites, the bridge, the reception hall, the observation lounge. I lived on deck 12 and worked everywhere between here and the hull. When you spend 18 months maintaining a ship's secondary systems, you learn every crawlspace, every junction box, every shortcut the engineers built in but never documented. Different maps." She filed that away too, the quiet competence of a man who had spent a year and a half learning a ship that was not his, crewed by people who did not acknowledge him, in service to a program that neither government valued. He had done it anyway. He had learned every seam and conduit of the ascending light the way a person learns a place they intend to protect, whether or not anyone asks them to. They emerged from the shaft onto deck 5. The corridor was dark but intact, no structural damage, no fires, just the failing amber emergency strips and the distant vibration of the ship settling into its death. Cole stopped at a reinforced door marked Auxiliary Power, authorized personnel only, and punched in an access code. The door opened. The auxiliary power relay compartment was the size of a large storage bay, a nest of cables and conduits and humming generators that provided backup power to the ship's critical systems when the main reactor was offline or compromised. The main reactor was, as of 8 minutes ago, both. Cole dropped to one knee beside the relay console and began working. His hands moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent a career learning how things broke and how to keep them running anyway. He pulled a panel free, identified 3 severed conduits, and began splicing them with materials from the emergency toolkit bolted to the bulkhead. Sierra watched him work for a moment. The Delaney relay system was not designed for manual operation. It was designed to run autonomously, maintained by certified engineers who followed 100-page diagnostic protocols. Cole was bypassing all of it. He stripped insulation with his teeth when the cutting tool jammed, used a length of emergency wire as a bridge between 2 incompatible junction types, and at one point held a conduit spliced together with his bare hand while he soldered the connection with the other, the heat close enough to redden the skin of his fingers. He did not complain. He did not narrate what he was doing. He simply worked, with the focused silence of a man who understood that the space between what a system was designed to do and what it could be made to do was where people like him lived. Sierra moved to the corridor-mounted comm panel and keyed the bridge repeater. "Kellys, are you still receiving?" "Static, then. I'm in evacuation pod 7, Your Highness. The bridge is empty." "Everyone is away." "Status of the pods?" 14 pods launched. 2 are damaged but pressurized. We're maintaining minimum thrust toward the inner patrol line. All crew accounted for except a pause. Except you and the human specialist. We are on deck 5. We are staying to maintain auxiliary power. Silence on the line. Then Kelly's, her voice stripped of its usual diplomatic precision. "Your Highness, please. The pods can carry 2 more. Not at the cost of shutting down the ship. If the ascending light goes dark, the Corvathi will turn their sensors on 16 slow-moving evacuation pods with no defensive capability. You know this." Kelly's did not argue, she knew. "Your Highness, Varith is dead. I found him when we evacuated the bridge." "I know. He would have wanted." "Kelly's, focus on the pods. I will focus on keeping you alive." The channel went quiet. Sierra turned back to Cole. He had 3 conduits stripped and was braiding their exposed filaments together with a technique she did not recognize human engineering. She supposed, learned in some garrison or repair yard on a world she had never visited. "How long?" she asked. 4 minutes to stabilize the relay. After that, I can reroute emergency power to the deflector array from here." "The deflector, that's not a weapon." "No, But if I pulse it at the right frequency, it'll read as a weapons charge on Corvathi sensors. They won't know the difference, not at 20 kilometers, not with the interference from the hull damage scrambling their scans. She stared at him. You want to bluff 3 warships with a deflector dish. I want to make 3 warships hesitate long enough for your people to get clear. She processed the implications. If I angle the ship to present our damaged port side, the armor there is already shredded. They'll read it as a vessel listing and drifting. They won't waste torpedoes on a dying hull, they'll focus on the pods, unless we give them a reason to focus on us. Cole looked up from the conduits. His gray-blue eyes held something she had not seen before, not surprise, not assessment, but recognition. The realization that the princess, who had spent 18 months as a ceremonial figurehead aboard his ship, was doing something that no one in the Villani court had expected her to do. She was fighting back. You handle the helm, he said. I'll handle the power. She moved to the secondary navigation station, a compact console designed for a helmsman's mate. Currently running on the auxiliary power Cole was nursing back to life. Her fingers found the controls, and the ship responded sluggishly. Helm authority reduced to 30%, lateral thrusters operating on reserve capacity. Every input delayed by the fractional seconds of a vessel running on its last reserves. She turned the ascending light. The helm fought her, the damaged thrusters responding in uneven bursts, the inertial dampeners offline, so she felt every degree of rotation in her bones, the ship swinging like a wounded animal forced to face its hunters. The great vessel, 300 meters of silver-white hull, its ceremonial markings scorched and peeling, its port side cratered with torpedo damage, swung on its lateral axis, until its nose pointed directly at the 3 Corvathi destroyers. Array is coming online, Cole reported. 60%, 70. Hold at 80. I want it to read ambiguous, high enough to threaten, low enough that they can't be sure. Smart. Desperate. Same thing sometimes. The first Corvathi destroyer adjusted its heading. Sierra watched it on the tactical display, the lead vessel swinging to face the ascending light, its weapons systems cycling from standby to active. The second destroyer followed. The third held position, still oriented toward the evacuation pods. 2 out of 3, she needed all 3. Kelly's, she keyed the comm. I need you to transmit a distress beacon on the Villani military emergency frequency. Wide broadcast. Include my personal identification codes. Your Highness, if Regent Dothran's officers intercept. Dothran already knows where I am. He sent the Corvathi. I need the inner patrol line to hear this. I need anyone who is still loyal to the throne to hear this. Transmitting now. The beacon went out. Sierra had no idea if anyone would hear it, or if anyone who heard it would come. The inner patrol line was staffed by Dothran's officers. The fleet was Dothran's fleet. The loyalty that should have been hers by birthright had been systematically dismantled over 8 years of quiet, methodical political erosion. Promotions blocked, loyalists transferred, command structures reshuffled until the military answered to the regent and considered the princess an afterthought. But the beacon went out, and her identification codes, the unique biometric signature that only a member of the Vale Kithra bloodline could generate, were embedded in every pulse. The deflector array hit 80%. The Corvathi sensors would be reading it as a potential weapons charge, not enough to damage a destroyer at this range, but enough to make a cautious commander hesitate, enough to force a tactical reassessment. The third destroyer turned. All 3 were now facing the ascending light. They've stopped tracking the pods, Cole said. He had pulled up a passive sensor feed on a secondary display and was watching the Corvathi formation. All weapons systems oriented on us. Good. It won't hold. They'll scan the deflector and figure out it's not a weapon. 3 minutes, maybe 4. The pods need 12 more minutes. He looked at her. The conduit splice was holding, his hands resting on his knees, and in the amber glow his face was streaked with grease, and a thin line of blood from the cut on his forearm that he still had not addressed. "I can pulse the array," he said. "Cycle at 80, drop to 40, spike to 90, make it erratic. An unstable weapon's charge looks more dangerous than a stable one. A stable one you can model, an unstable one might detonate." "That's insane. That's human engineering." She almost laughed. The sound caught in her throat, somewhere between hysteria and genuine amusement, and she pressed her lips together and swallowed it down. The Villani did not laugh during crisis. It was considered unseemly, a failure of composure that betrayed emotional instability. But he had said it with such flat sincerity, human engineering, as though the act of improvising a weapon from a deflector dish on a dying ship was simply what his species did. "Do it," she said. He pulsed the array. The readings on the Corvathi sensors would be spiking and dropping a pattern that looked exactly like a weapons system on the edge of catastrophic overload. A system that might fire or might explode, and the only way to know which was to wait and see. The Corvathi waited. On the passive sensor feed, Sierra could see their formation tightening, the three destroyers drawing closer together, their weapons systems cycling through target acquisition patterns but not firing. They were confused. A dying transport had just turned toward them and started charging something that their sensors could not conclusively identify, and every tactical manual they had been trained on said the same thing. Do not engage an unknown weapons system until you can model its yield. Confusion was a weapon. Cole had handed it to her, and she intended to use every second of it. The minutes passed. Each one felt like an hour. Sierra stood at the helm, her hands on the controls, her eyes on the tactical display, watching the three destroyers hold position, watching the tiny dots of the evacuation pods creep across the display toward the inner system, toward safety, toward the patrol line that might or might not be willing to receive them. 9 minutes left, then 8, then 7. At 7 minutes, one of the Corvathi destroyers launched a probe, a small sensor drone designed to get close enough to the ascending light to scan the deflector array and determine whether the weapon's charge was real. Sierra saw it on the passive display, a tiny dot separating from the lead destroyer and accelerating toward them. "Probe incoming," she said. Cole glanced at the display without stopping his work on the relay. "How long until it reaches scanning range?" 2 minutes, maybe less. "If it scans the array, it'll know the charge is fake. Game over." Sierra's mind raced. The probe was too small to target with the deflector, and even if she could, redirecting the array to hit a sensor drone would reveal that it was not, in fact, a weapons system. She needed another option. She found one in the ship's debris. The ascending light was trailing wreckage, hull fragments, shattered armor plating, components torn loose by the torpedo impacts. A cloud of debris surrounded the ship, drifting outward in a slowly expanding sphere. If she adjusted the ship's rotation just a few degrees, enough to shift the debris field. "I'm going to tumble the ship," she said. "You're going to what?" "Induce a lateral roll, controlled, slow enough that it looks like structural failure, fast enough to scatter the debris field into the probe's approach vector. The probe's navigation system will have to compensate for the debris. It'll either slow down or abort." That's actually brilliant. That's desperation dressed up as tactics. She entered the commands. The ascending light began a slow, controlled roll on its longitudinal axis, the kind of rotation that, from the outside, would look like a dying ship losing its attitude control. The debris field shifted with it, fragments of hull plating and shattered composite spreading into a wider pattern across the probe's approach path. On the display, the probe's trajectory stuttered. It decelerated, began to navigate around the larger fragments, and then, as a particularly dense cluster of debris forced it into a course correction that added 90 seconds to its transit time, Sierra allowed herself to breathe. 90 seconds. It was not much, but it was 90 seconds the pods could use. At 6 minutes, Cole's hands moved sharply on the relay. A conduit had started to smoke, insulation degrading under the sustained load. He killed it, rerouted through a backup line, and the array flickered for 2 seconds before stabilizing. "Close?" she asked without turning from the helm. "Close enough." 5 minutes. The pods were past the halfway mark. "Your Highness." Cole's voice was different now, quieter, stripped of the operational tone. "If the Corvathi figure this out before the pods are clear, they'll fire on us first. We'll have about 10 seconds between their torpedo launch and impact." "I'm aware. 10 seconds is not enough time to reach an evacuation pod. It's not enough time to do anything except be here, I know." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the words came slowly, as though each one had been weighed. "For the record, Your Highness, I've served on 11 postings in 16 years. 7 were combat deployments. 3 were classified. I've been shot twice, burned once, and left for dead on a station that depressurized while I was still inside it. In all of that, the only time I volunteered to stay on a dying vessel was today." She turned from the helm. He was looking at her with those steady, stormwater eyes, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to vulnerable she had ever seen on him, not afraid, not pleading, but open, unguarded. "Why?" she asked again. "Because in 18 months on this ship, you were the only person who did not treat me like I was invisible." She blinked. "I barely spoke to you." "You didn't have to speak to me. When you walked through the lower decks on your inspection rounds, you looked at people. The other officers looked through them, through me, through the technicians, through the maintenance staff. You looked at us. You nodded. Once on Deck 11, you stopped and asked a ventilation technician if the air recyclers on that level were adequate, and when she said they pulled damp, you filed a maintenance request that afternoon. Nobody asked you to do that. Nobody on Decks 5 through 12 expected a princess to notice." She remembered the damp-air complaint. Technician Lura, a quiet woman with blue-gray hands stained from chemical work, who had been startled that a royal had addressed her directly. Sierra had filed the request because the air quality on the lower decks was a health concern, and nobody else appeared to care. She had not realized anyone was watching. "You see people," Cole said simply. "That's rare on any ship. It's unheard of on one run by a court that's been trained to pretend you don't exist." The words settled into her like something heavy and warm. She did not know how to respond in the Delaney diplomatic register, the layered, cushioned speech of courtiers and counsels. So she responded the only way she could think of, which was directly. "You came up 4 decks through a burning ship for that." "I came up 4 decks because nobody else was going to. Because when the first torpedo hit, I watched the bridge crew respond, damage control, shields, evasive maneuvers, every procedure by the book. But nobody moved to protect you. Nobody positioned themselves between you and the blast. Nobody said, we need to get you out of here." They had duties. They had conditioning. 8 years of being taught that the princess is a figurehead and the regent gives the orders. When the ship started dying, their training kicked in, and their training didn't include keeping you alive. "So you came." "So I came, because someone had to, because you were standing on a dying bridge with blood on your face and nobody was looking at you, and that was wrong." 3 minutes. The pods needed 3 more minutes. The first conduit burned out. The compartment lights flickered. The deflector reading dropped from its erratic cycling to a flat line, and Sierra watched the Corvathi formation on the tactical display begin to shift, the lead destroyer's weapons cycling back to active, its nose swinging toward the ascending light with predatory intent. "The relay is failing," Cole said. The operational tone was back, but she could hear the strain beneath it. I've got 2 conduits that are going to burn out in about 90 seconds. When they go, the deflector goes dark, and they'll know it was a bluff. 2 minutes, 120 seconds between her crew and death. Can you restart it? Once, maybe. I can short-circuit the backup capacitor and force a 10-second surge through the system. It'll burn out everything afterward, but for 10 seconds, the deflector will spike to full power. And on Corvathy sensors, a detonation sequence, a ship about to blow its reactor. Will they run? If they think a 300-meter vessel is about to go critical 20 kilometers from their formation, yeah, they'll run. 1 minute, 60 seconds. The second conduit burned out. The array went dark. The Corvathy destroyers began to close, all 3 accelerating toward the ascending light, weapons hot, torpedo tubes cycling. Now, she asked. Wait. His hand hovered over the capacitor. Wait until they commit. When they're close enough that the blast radius would catch them, that's when it scares them. That's when they break. She watched the display. The destroyers were closing fast 20 kilometers, 18, 15. Their torpedo solutions were locked. She could see the targeting indicators on the passive display, 3 bright red lines converging on the ascending light's position, mathematical trajectories that ended in the compartment where she was standing. This was the moment. Either the bluff worked or it did not. Either Cole's capacitor surge convinced 3 warship captains that a royal transport was about to detonate its reactor, or it failed, and the next thing she would feel would be the hull crumpling around her at the speed of a Corvathy torpedo. She looked at Cole. His hand was on the capacitor, his body perfectly still, his eyes on the display. He was not looking at the destroyers, he was looking at her. Their eyes met for 1 second. In that second, she understood something that required no words in any language. He was not afraid of the torpedoes. He was afraid of failing her. He had staked everything, his life, his career, his lonely 18 months of invisible service, on the chance that a dying deflector dish could scare 3 warships, and the only thing that frightened him was the possibility that it would not be enough. 12 kilometers, 10. Now, she said. Cole's hand moved. The sound of the capacitor discharging was a sharp, electric crack that echoed through the compartment and made the hair on her arms stand upright. The relay surged. Every remaining system on the ascending light flared to life, lights blazing, consoles cycling, the deflector array spiking to 112% of rated capacity in a single, blinding pulse. On the Corvathy sensors, the reading would look like a reactor going critical, an antimatter containment failure, a blast radius that would swallow anything within 50 kilometers. The destroyers broke formation. She watched them scatter, 3 warships that had been closing for the kill now accelerating away in 3 different vectors, their engines burning at maximum thrust, their weapons systems going cold as every joule of power was redirected to propulsion. The surge lasted 9 seconds, then the relay died, the compartment went dark. Every system on the ascending light went black except the emergency battery strips along the floor, casting the compartment in a faint blue glow. Silence. Sierra stood in the dark, her hands still on the helm controls that no longer responded. The ship drifted the slow, unpowered rotation of a vessel with no engines, no helm, no thrust, dead in space. She pulled up the passive sensor display, the last system still drawing from the emergency batteries. The screen was small, low resolution, barely readable. The Corvathy destroyers were retreating, still accelerating, running from a detonation that would never come. And the evacuation pods, 14 bright dots on the display, had crossed the minimum safe distance line. Sierra exhaled. The breath came out shaking, visible in the air as life support faded and the temperature dropped. She pressed her palms flat against the dead console and let her head drop forward, and for a moment she was not a princess, not a strategist, not a survivor. She was 26 years old, bleeding from the cut above her eye, standing in a dead relay compartment on a dead ship in a dead corridor of space, and alive. The weight of it, the accumulated terror and calculation and grief of the past 30 minutes, settled onto her shoulders like a physical load. She had not allowed herself to feel any of it while the crisis demanded her attention. Now, in the silence, it arrived all at once. The image of Verith lying on the bridge deck, the sound of Kelly's voice breaking on the comm, the knowledge that her own uncle had arranged her death with the same administrative efficiency he used to schedule council meetings. The Delaney court trained its royals to compartmentalize emotion, to process grief on a schedule dictated by protocol. But there was no protocol for this. There was no ceremony for the moment. A princess discovers that the family she was born into has decided she is expendable. "You should let me look at that." Cole's voice. Close. She looked up and found him standing 2 paces away, a medkit in his hand, a small Delaney emergency kit from the compartment's wall mount. He was looking at the blood dried on her temple. "It's nothing. You've been bleeding for 25 minutes and you haven't addressed it because you were busy saving everyone on this ship. Sit down." She stared at him. In the Delaney court, no one spoke to a princess that way, not with that level of direct, unembellished concern. The court spoke in circumlocutions and veiled suggestions perhaps Her Highness might consider, and it would be prudent for the crown to allow. No one said sit down, the way they would say it to any other person who was bleeding and exhausted and needed someone to notice. She sat, on the floor, her back against the dead relay console, her legs folded beneath her. The ceremonial robe she had been wearing when the first torpedo hit, pale silver silk designed for a diplomatic reception, she would now never attend, were torn and smudged with conduit grease. Cole knelt beside her. He opened the medkit and found the antiseptic swabs, the Delaney formulation, designed for the Delaney biochemistry, but he handled them with the familiarity of someone who had studied the differences. "How do you know the Delaney field medicine?" she asked. "I read the manual 18 months ago when I came aboard, first thing I did." "The first thing?" "I figured if someone got hurt, it shouldn't matter whether the medic was on the right deck. Someone should know what to do." He cleaned the cut gently, his fingers steady. The antiseptic was cool against her skin, and the precision of his touch surprised her, careful, professional, and entirely focused on the wound rather than the fact that he was touching a princess's face. In the Delaney court, physical contact between a royal and a non-royal required formal authorization, witness consent, and a record filed with the protocol office. Cole had skipped all of it. He had seen a person bleeding and had acted, and the simplicity of that, the absolute absence of ceremony, was more disarming than any courtly gesture she had ever received. He applied the wound seal, a thin bioactive strip that bonded to the Delaney skin and promoted cellular repair. His thumb pressed it into place along her temple with the same careful pressure he had used on the conduit splices, and the contact was brief, and something about it made her throat tighten. 18 months, she said quietly. "You have been on this ship for 18 months, and I learned your name today. Garrison specialists don't get introduced to the royal house. I ate in the auxiliary mess. My quarters were on deck 12 below the cargo hold. The only crew member who spoke to me voluntarily was Verith, the sensor technician." Verith, the name hit her in the chest. The young man who had brought her tea during a late watch, who lay dead on the bridge deck 2 floors above. "He asked me once if humans really eat with metal utensils," Cole said. "I told him we use forks. He thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard, kept calling them tiny tridents." The image pierced through her composure. Verith, wide-eyed and laughing, incredulous at the concept of forks, and she felt her eyes sting. Not tears. The Delaney did not weep openly, but the pressure behind her eyes built, and she did not try to stop it. "I'm sorry about Verith," she said. "Me too," He was quiet for a moment. He was the only one on the ship who asked me anything personal. Everyone else, the Delaney crew, the officers, even the other humans in the exchange program, they kept the professional distance. Vareth didn't know how to do that. He'd sit down in the auxiliary mess across from me and just talk about his family back on the homeworld, about the music he liked, about whether humans really couldn't hear subsonic frequencies, or whether we were just pretending. What did you tell him? That we really can't hear them. He was disappointed. He said his favorite compositions were in the subsonic range, and he wanted to share them with someone who'd never heard the Lanny music before. Sierra closed her eyes. Vareth had been 23. He had enlisted in the Royal Fleet because his family could not afford the university tuition on the homeworld, and military service came with educational credits. He had told Sierra this once, during the late watch, while she sipped the oversteeped tea he had made, told her with the unself-conscious directness of someone who did not yet understand that confiding in a princess was unusual. She had liked him for it. She had liked his honesty, his curiosity, the way he treated every interaction as though it were the first of many. He would not have any more. The ship drifted in the dark. The temperature continued to drop. Cole found a thermal blanket in the emergency supplies and draped it across her shoulders without asking, then sat down beside her, not touching, not close, but present, occupying the same space in the failing light. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Life support batteries will last about 6 hours on this deck. After that, temperature drops below what either of us can survive. And rescue depends on whether your beacon reached anyone who cares." The honesty was brutal and refreshing in equal measure. The Delaney court would have wrapped that assessment in 17 layers of diplomatic cushioning. Cole delivered it the way he delivered everything: flat, factual, and with enough respect for her intelligence to trust that she could handle the truth. "Dothran will claim I died in a Corvathi raid," she said. "An unprovoked attack on a diplomatic vessel. He will express grief. He will wear the mourning colors for the prescribed period, and he will assume the throne permanently. Unless you survive. Unless I survive, which he has arranged to prevent. Your uncle sounds like someone I'd enjoy arresting." Despite everything, the corner of her mouth twitched. It was not a smile. She was not capable of smiling right now. But it was the closest thing to one she had produced since the first torpedo, and it surprised her. "That would violate approximately 47 articles of the Delaney-Terran Diplomatic Compact," she said. 48. There's a subsection on detaining foreign heads of state that's buried in the appendix. I read it during a particularly boring overnight shift on Deck 12. "You read the Diplomatic Compact?" "I read everything on the ship. There wasn't much else to do." She looked at him. In the faint blue light, his profile was all shadow and angles: the crooked jaw, the short dark hair silvering at the temples, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he was thinking. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ceiling, at the pipes and conduits he had nursed back to life long enough to save 14 pods full of people he had never spoken to. She opened her mouth to say something, she was not sure what, only that the silence between them felt charged with something she did not have a Delaney word for when the comm panel crackled. "Ascending light, this is the Delaney cruiser Vale's resolve. We are responding to your emergency beacon. Please confirm status and position." Sierra's heart slammed against her ribs. She lunged for the panel, and her fingers were shaking when she keyed the transmit. "Vale's resolve, this is Princess Sierra Vale Kithra. The ascending light is disabled. 2 souls aboard. We need immediate extraction." A pause. Then a voice she recognized: Admiral Tessara, who had served Sierra's father before the illness, before Dothran, before the long erosion. A voice that had been pushed to the margins of the fleet but never silenced entirely. "Your Highness, we received your beacon. We are en route. ETA 11 minutes. Admiral, the Corvathi attack was not random. The escort frigates were recalled on Regent Dothran's authority 20 minutes before the attack. This was a coordinated assassination attempt. Silence, longer than tactical communication allowed. When Tessara spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a career's worth of restraint finally breaking. Understood, Your Highness. The Vale's resolve is not alone. I have 3 cruisers and the battle cruiser Throne's Edge with me. We are loyal to the crown. How? Your father's standing order, Your Highness. Before the illness took his voice, he issued one final directive to the officers he trusted. If the beacon ever transmitted, come. We have been waiting for 8 years. The words hit Sira with the force of a torpedo. Her father, Sovereign Aelith Vale Kithra, who had ruled the Valani with a quiet authority that made lesser rulers look theatrical, had known. He had seen what Dothran was building, even as the illness crept through his nervous system and stole his speech, his movement, his ability to govern. And in the final days before silence claimed him entirely, he had reached out to the officers he trusted most and given them one last order. Wait for her. When the time comes, she will call. And you will answer. He had believed in her, even when the court dismissed her, even when Dothran's allies whispered that the princess was too young, too inexperienced, too soft for the throne. Her father had looked at the same woman the court overlooked and had seen someone worth building a contingency around. She had not known. 8 years of believing she was alone, and the whole time a fleet had been waiting. Sira leaned against the comm panel. Her hands were still shaking. Behind her, she heard Cole exhale a long, controlled breath, the first audible sign of relief he had shown. Your Highness, Tessara continued, I must inform you the beacon you transmitted included your personal identification codes. The entire inner system received it. Every patrol line, every garrison, every command post, Dothran's officers heard it. They know you are alive. Good. It will force his hand. That is the point. She released the transmit key. In the silence that followed, the comm channel hummed with static, and then a second voice broke through, unfamiliar, younger, carrying the clipped diction of a patrol officer. Ascending light, this is Commander Rail of the cruiser Steadfast Vigil. We monitored your beacon and are breaking formation from the inner patrol line. ETA 14 minutes. Then a third, Ascending Light Destroyer Ethari's shield responding, loyal to the crown, inbound. Then silence. Then a fourth, fainter, distorted by distance. This is the garrison station at Delta Point. We read your codes. Standing by for orders, Your Highness. Sira stood at the comm panel and listened to the voices come in, one after another, ships and stations and officers who had been silent for years, who had watched Dothran consolidate power and said nothing because there was nothing to say, no signal to rally around, no proof that the princess they served still drew breath and still intended to fight. The beacon had given them proof, and now they were answering. Not all of them. Some channels remained silent, the patrol lines Dothran controlled absolutely, the officers whose loyalty he had purchased rather than earned. But enough. Enough voices to tell her that the Valani sovereignty was not as broken as Dothran believed. Cole, standing behind her, said nothing. But she heard him set the thermal blanket down on the console, and she knew he was watching the passive display, counting the signals, doing the same arithmetic she was doing. Enough ships to shield the evacuation pods, enough firepower to make the Corvathi think twice about returning, enough loyal officers to turn a political crisis into a political reckoning. She turned from the panel. Cole was standing now, the thermal blanket folded in his hands, and he was looking at her with that expression she was beginning to understand, steady, direct, carrying something that was not devotion and not infatuation, but something more fundamental. Recognition. He had seen her. Not the princess, not the figurehead, not the jewel of the throne, a phrase Dothran had used in public speeches, and which sounded like praise and meant ornament. Cole had seen a woman who turned a dying ship toward 3 warships to save her crew, who stood on a failing bridge and refused to leave, who sat in the dark and calculated odds and chose the path that cost the most because it was the only path that mattered. He had seen her, and he had stayed. "The Admiral will be here in 11 minutes, Sira said. "When she arrives, I will need to take command of the situation. There will be a political crisis. Dothran will deny everything. The court will fracture. It will be the most dangerous period in the Lanny governance in 300 years. Sounds complicated. It will be. And I will need people who are not loyal to Dothran, not loyal to the throne because they were conditioned to be, but because they chose to be." He looked at her for a long moment. The blue emergency light painted them both, and in that light the distance between them, the gulf of species and rank and culture that should have made this conversation impossible, felt like nothing at all. "I'm a garrison specialist," he said. "I clean air processors. You kept a dying ship alive with 2 burned-out conduits and a backup capacitor. You came up 4 decks through wreckage to a bridge you had no authorization to enter. You stayed on a vessel everyone else abandoned." She held his gaze. "You saw me when no one else was looking. I don't need a garrison specialist. I need someone who stays." He was quiet. Then slowly, the faintest shift in his expression, not a smile, not quite, but a softening of the hard lines around his eyes, a release of tension she had not realized he was carrying. "I'm not going anywhere, Your Highness." She held his gaze for a long moment. The distance between them was 3 paces, the same professional distance he had maintained since the bridge, the distance mandated by a military code written by people who had never imagined this situation, and would not have known what to make of it if they had. 3 paces, it was nothing, it was everything. "Sira," she said. He blinked. "My name is Sira. And when the Admiral arrives and the court fractures and the Regency collapses, when all of that happens, I will need someone beside me who calls me by my name, not my title, not my station, my name." He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, not surprise, because he had stopped being surprised by her somewhere between the bridge and the relay compartment, but something quieter. The look of a man who had spent 18 months being invisible and was now being told by the most consequential person on the ship that she saw him, that she needed him, that the seeing was the point. "Sira," he said, testing it. The words sounded different in his voice, rougher, less musical than the Lanny pronunciation, shaped by a mouth that was not designed for the vowel structure of her language. It should have sounded wrong. It did not sound wrong. The ship drifted in the dark. Somewhere ahead, the lights of a Lanny cruiser were growing brighter. Somewhere behind, 3 Corvathi destroyers were running from a bluff they would never confirm. Somewhere in the Lanny capital, a regent was receiving a beacon that carried a princess's voice and her biometric codes, and the architecture of his betrayal was beginning to crack. And in a failing relay compartment on Deck 5, an alien princess with blood drying on her temple and a human garrison specialist with conduit grease on his hands sat in the blue emergency light. The distance between them was exactly right, close enough to matter, far enough to mean something. She said his name, and he said hers, and in the silence of a dying ship, that was enough. It was the beginning of something the court would spend years trying to name, and never succeed.